I'm a boat builder from the Cotswolds in the UK, and I'm currently building a boat called Temptress, designed by Michelle Berrier and kitted by myself to be built utilising the latest in CAD design, CNC cutting and modern epoxy wood construction. In this video I am building frame 9, which is one of the biggest frames within the boat. It contains the main bulkhead that separates the engine bay and the cockpit, and it's quite a big beast, as you can see. I'm going to be running you through the process of building the frames. If you're new to the series, then that'll be the first time you've seen it. If you're not new to the series, then I'm apologising because we're going through much of the same thing we've already done. So I'll run you through the process for that. Then we're going to resource some veneers so that we can veneer this giant bulkhead that sits on the forward side of this frame, and that's going to form the rear seat back and the front of the engine compartment as well. We're going to resort and book match those veneers, place them onto the face of the plywood, and then we're going to vacuum bag it into place. So I'm going to put this down and let's get started with building the frame. This thing's a monster. Oh. So if you're new to the project, then the way that I'm building frames within this boat is that I'm starting out with CNC cut components. All the framing in this boat is cut from solid utility boards, and I'm arranging each of those components for the best grain orientation within each of the relevant parts of the frame. Each of those CNC cut frame components has a hole cut through it, and that corresponds to a hole that's in this table that you can see me assembling the parts onto here. That allows me to get the frames nice and square and to arrange everything in a good uniform manner so we get really even frames. And you can see that parts also locate with notches between components. So the first side components get dry fit onto the table, and then I install the gussets onto one side of the frame. This is all dry fitting at this stage, just for me to get parts properly located. So each of the gussets have a small hole drilled through them that we're going to put a pin through in just a minute, and then I'll masking tape up the edges just to prevent the spread of epoxy and try and keep things as neat as I can within the glue up stage. That frame then gets disassembled and we're ready to begin gluing up the components. Now I use a two-step bonding process for all of the frames here. So what I'm doing is I'm wetting out all of the mating glue faces with unthickened epoxy first. Once that's done, I'll then come back and revisit all the glue joints with thickened epoxy. So this is West System epoxy thickened with their colloidal silica. You can see that by leaving some pieces in place on the board and releasing some from their dowels, I can assemble those joints in a lateral motion so that we're compressing the glue joint. The gussets then get put back into place, and I'll install a pin through that hole just really to prevent slippage of the component whilst it's clamped down. The addition of these MFT holes through the frame construction table allow me to use hold down clamps, and that's just going to pull down my parts and compress that glue joint nice and solidly. The following day the clamps get released and the pins get pulled out using power pincers. I'll also remove that masking tape, and you can see that just helps to give me a slightly cleaner edge there. It's also a really good reference with applying the unthickened epoxy, just to have that masking tape there. A little pry bar just helps me to release that part from the table, and it doesn't stick very much at all due to the fact that I'm using plastic dowels for alignment here, and I've also got my table covered in polythene. So I'll flip the frame over, and then a set of mole grips on one of those dowels and a slight tweak just breaks that glue joint and allows me to pull that out of the frame. I've been using this same dowel set throughout all the frames that I've done so far, so this has actually been working quite nicely, this process. So once frame 9 was done, we needed to start work on the bulkhead. And this is going to be a large, solid bulkhead that divides the cockpit and the engine compartment. So what I've opted for here is 12mm plywood, and then I'm going to put a 3mm veneer on either face of that plywood to take me up to the full 18mm thickness that I need. So I wanted to resaw some really nice utility veneer to face off that plywood and give a really beautiful finish, because I'm not really a big fan of standard plywood grain that you tend to get in off-the-shelf boards. So I'm starting with some sawn utility boards here, and what I'm doing is an initial rip cut at 130mm wide, just to give me one nice straight reference edge to work from. And then once I've cut that at 130, I'm coming in and just doing a second pass at 120mm, so I've got two really nice parallel edges to those boards. We're then ready to set up the bandsaw for resawing. So one of the very key elements to getting good resaw work on the bandsaw, particularly when using a power feed, is to have a good sharp blade. So this blade in there has done quite a bit of work so far on this project. So that's coming out, and we're going to pop a new one in there just so we've got a nice, fresh, clean, straight cut on the bandsaw. So we'll get the new blade in, we'll get that tensioned up, we'll check it for tracking to see how it's doing, make a slight adjustment if necessary, check the bearings to make sure we've got good support of the blade, and we're ready to start cutting. Now I'm just doing the first section of the cut by hand here, so the idea really is to get enough of the board through the machine so that I can then set up the tension on the power feed. So we'll cut that a certain way through, make sure that I'm happy with the cut and the width of the cut that I'm doing between the blade and the fence. Then I can stop the saw, get the power feed moved into place, and put the correct pressure on the board. Then we can fire up the power feed, and that's just going to be an extra helping hand to keep that moving through the saw nice and evenly, keep a good tension on it, and it allows me to be hands-free when I walk from the front of the saw to the back of the saw to support the board. It also keeps a nice steady pace for that cut all the way throughout the process, so we're not stopping and starting and creating burn marks within the stock. So I'm using stock here that's around about 26-27mm thick, and I managed to resaw that into 4 veneers, which I'm then going to machine down. So I'm cutting it around about 5mm thick for a sawn thickness, and then I'm machining them in the sander down to around about 3mm, because I'm starting with a 12mm plywood bulkhead and I need to get to 18, so I want a 3mm veneer on either face of my plywood. So I'll machine those down in the sander, taking down to that final 3mm thickness. So we start out by just striking a center line down the middle of that bulkhead, which is going to give me a nice reference to start from. Because I want to book match these veneers, we're going to start in the middle of the bulkhead and work outwards so we can have a nice mirrored grain of those boards. It doesn't really take much extra effort to book match these, so I think it's a nice additional thing to do. So the thought process behind book matching is exactly as it says, really. If you imagine opening a book, so you've got a page facing each other, we do the same thing with the sawn board. So where it's sawn up the middle, we fold that open, and that creates this mirrored grain that you can see here. So we can create really nice symmetrical patterns throughout the part. So I'll select the two matching boards from the stack of 4 that I got from the same piece of stock, open those out, and then we'll start trimming them to length. So each of the veneers just need the edges dressing so that they meet nicely and create a good fine joint between each of the sections. We want to get that as good as we can, really, but not massively crazy because this isn't a particularly visible part of the boat. But it's nice to just take care over those things anyway. So they often take 2 or 3 different passes with the plane just to take a look at the gap up the middle of each board. Do another pass with the plane and just take little trimmings off until things are starting to look right. So the Stanley number 5 plane is nice to get a good starting straight edge on these veneers, and then my little Veritas apron plane just finishes things off there where necessary. The boards then get roughly trimmed to length, and it's only got to be rough at this stage because we're going to trim these down with a flush trim bit post glue up. Once all the veneers are cut, these then get taped together, and this is just to help me keep this in one big manageable sheet. I tend to actually split things up through the middle, but this just helps it keep all the veneers in good reference to each other and mean that I can just handle the whole thing when it comes to glue up, which you will see in just a second. So you can see the effect of that book matching there, where we've got mirrored grain as we separate from the center of the bulkhead outwards. Now I've got two sets of these veneers to have to cut because I'm veneering both sides of this bulkhead. So we do one side, we're going to take that out of the way and have that as the side one pack, and then we'll cut another set of veneers for the second side. Now it's a really nice detail to add into this boat with veneering this bulkhead, but in reality, in most of the cases actually, if I was doing this as a paid job, there probably wouldn't be a cost able to justify me doing this work. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, this veneering process of resawing the veneers and cutting them to size, vacuum bagging them down to this bulkhead, took me around about 12 hours to do. So you've got 12 hours labor there, and then when it comes to gluing up for epoxy, I used around about 100 pumps of epoxy for this process. Now, as a rule of thumb, that works out around about £1 a pump. So if you want to do the maths on that, you could work out roughly the cost difference versus if I just used a straightforward off-the-shelf piece of plywood here to go into the extent that I'm doing to veneer this and book match it. You've got an extra 12 hours labor onto the job there and an extra around about £100 worth of epoxy, not to mention the utility wood as well. But the thing that I want to do with this project is make it the absolute best that I can be, and I think it's details such as this that are really going to take this boat to the next level. So I really want to take the time to focus on some of those finer details that only a handful of people may notice, but you guys have seen me do it now, so there you go. Hopefully it's appreciated. So you can see that I've created an envelope with a vacuum bag here, so it's going to run underneath this bulkhead, and then I'm going to fold it over the top once we're all glued up. So we're laying down the first side of veneers for the underside first of all. We'll get them nicely placed, and then we're ready to mix up some glue. So what I'm doing here is I'm wetting out all of the surfaces with unthickened epoxy first. So again, this is a two-step bonding process. So we prime all the surfaces with unthickened epoxy. That's both the veneers and the face of the plywood. So we'll meter out some epoxy into there, mix that up using my little drill paddle mixer. Then I'll get that decanted into a roller tray, and we're ready to start application. So rolling that onto the mating faces of the veneers here, and you can see the beautiful colour of that utility coming through. So when I get to the final stages of finishing and varnishing these veneers on this face, this is going to look really nice, and there's a little initial indication of what colour that might come out at. So I'll also coat the face of the plywood bulkhead. This sort of plywood is really absorbent, so that's a really critical thing to do there, just to wet that out first with unthickened epoxy. Once we've done that on both parts, we can then go over to our thickened epoxy, which is going to create a little bit of gap filling if necessary, and it's just going to create us a little bit more of a thickness to our glue line there. So I'm using the West System 405 filleting blend to thicken this epoxy, and that's going to give me a wood coloured finish. So I do this in any instance where the glue line is potentially going to be visible in a finished varnished place, which is going to be the back of the rear seat in this instance. So I use the 405 additive for the majority of the thickening, and then you can see I put a small amount of pure mahogany dust in there just to get that colour down to what I want it to be. And that just means that if I get any glue come out in between the veneers into the glue line, I've got a correctly colour matched glue line there, and it's not going to be like a white colloidal silica line, which can look quite nasty over time in a bright finished scenario. So I'll get that spread out with the notched spreader there. I'm using the fine tooth edge of the notch spreader to give a nice even glue line across all of the veneers on the underside of the part. Then the bulkhead can get laid down onto that. Which you can see is a little bit of a precarious job. Then we're ready to wet out the second set of veneers. So I'll just lay those out on the table, wet those out with unthickened epoxy. And the same with the second face of the plywood bulkhead. And then we can go in again with our thickened epoxy, spread out with a notch spreader just to give us that good even glue line thickness, and also a nice little bit of gap filling should we need it. So you can see that by angling my notch spreader in a sort of snow plow direction, you can see that I'm able to push that thickened epoxy constantly up in one direction and just move it throughout the width of the board. So it gives a really nice controlled method of distributing this. If you do that with a notch spreader straight, and what you'll find is that the excess comes off of either side of the spreader and you end up in quite a mess. So you can see that because those veneers are taped together, I'm able to pick that up as a whole pack, place that using my center line as a reference there, and get that positioned nicely. And just check the top and bottom for height to make sure that we're in the correct place vertically, and then get that dropped down. The tape also just helps to reduce the bleed of the epoxy coming up through those joints, I find. It just makes things a little bit neater. So then I can apply the bagging tape to the vacuum bag film. We can fold over the second side of that envelope and get that sealed down so that we're then ready to start vacuuming. So you can see I've got the breech set up in the middle of the bag there, and that's just going to allow my pump to connect into this sealed bag, which runs underneath the part around one end, and then it's sealed on three sides. So we'll connect up the pump, we'll let it start to pull a negative pressure inside that bag, and you can see that the atmosphere surrounding that bag is creating a nice compression evenly in from all sides onto our part. Now this bagging film is really quite nice because it's slightly embossed, which means that I don't need to use a breather film to allow that vacuum to travel through the component. So if you're doing wood vacuum bag setups such as this is a really nice bag to use. And this is made by ProSet. It's called their Teak Deck bagging film. So you can see the setup there. I've got a little Becker pump that just runs through into a catch pot just in case we get any resin come through. I've got one breech in the center of the part there, and we're pulling a nice vacuum of -0.8 bar. So we'll leave that to run overnight, and then we'll come and visit it tomorrow once the epoxy's cured, and we'll see what's going on. So you can see we've got a really nice consolidation of the part there. We've got some epoxy pulled up even through that wood grain actually, so you can see how that pump purges all the air out from within that glue up and gets us an incredibly solid glue line. So I'm hitting this out first of all with the belt sander with a 40 grit belt on there, giving this a nice heavy cut across the grain, which is going to cut really nice and quickly. And that's just going to take out any of the slight highs that we might have with those planks and just allow me to bring it down to the lows. So there's no chance of sanding through this veneer here. We've got a 3mm veneer and we've got a really flat sand, so there's no danger of that. So 2 passes, 1 across the grain, 1 with the grain just to finish up and get rid of those cross grain scratches. And then I'm able to trim the outside, so just run around that with a little flush trim, route a bit with a bearing guide on it, and that's just going to take my veneers down to the same shape and size as the plywood bulkhead that sits beneath. Just give that one little final run over with the DA sander with an 80 grit disc on it just to soften things up a little bit more. We'll give this a final sand before it goes into the boat, but you can see there that beautiful book matched grain across the board. So I think it's a really good move going for that instead of a standard plywood grain, which I don't particularly favour. So now I can get this placed onto the frame, and then we're almost ready to do the 3D carving. So if you haven't seen this process before, if you're new to the series, first of all, welcome along to it. Secondly, what I'm doing here is I'm returning the frames that I've made to the CNC machine, and then when they're back on the CNC machine, that's allowing me to cut all of the notches and the bevels within the frame that will land all of the timbers as we go into assembly further down the line. So started out as a bit of experimental process, but since the test run that I did in one of the earlier videos, I'm really pleased with how this process is working and glad that I did it. This is quite a beast of a frame, as you can see, but it's a beautiful looking thing. We've got nice book match veneer on both sides of that there, and time to get it on the machine to do the 3D carving process. So the frame gets located using the same dowel holes that we use to build the frame on the construction table upstairs. So you can see those holes still through the components there and now drilled through the bulkhead that it's installed to as well. So I drilled some holes in my spoil board on my CNC machine, and these dowels then locate the frame to that hole drilling operation. That hole drilling operation is in the same process as the carving operation that machine's about to do to the frame. So I know that the two are positively registered to each other. Now this frame, I've held it down just under its own weight because it is such a heavy beast. So just purely the effect of those dowels to locate that frame and it's sitting under its own weight was enough in this instance. We then start out with a roughing operation. So the first process that I run here is a large 12mm upcut spiral, and that's just going to rough out the bulk of the material in certain areas of the frame just to get the bulk of the work done. and get me a little bit closer to what the final component's going to be. So that's going to do some of the cutouts that aren't there on the existing framing, and that's going to do some of the beveling work in certain areas of the frame. Now, frame 9 within this boat is actually an angled frame because this forms the seat back of the rear seat. This is angled backwards at 10 degrees, so it's got some funny cutouts in it in comparison to all the other frames that are quite straight. So you can see the beveling process here, where those top side battens are going to go through that frame. They're actually coming through at an angle, and this will need to be cut on a two-sided operation for this frame. So you can see we've just got an angle on one side of those cutouts for now. So the roughing process leaves us with this stepped finish to the frame, and then we'll come back and run around that again with a rounded cove nose cutting bit, and that's just going to take off that final little 1.5mm material around the outside. It's going to smooth out all those steps and give me a really neatly carved component. And you can see we're just coming around doing the final pass here on the first side of the carving operation. And that gets us a beautifully dimensioned, pre-beveled, pre-notched frame for frame 9, middle part of the boat. Okay, so that is frame 9 built and glued up. We've got the bulkhead veneered and vacuum bagged down. I was actually planning this video to be about frame 9 and frame 4 because they're both quite major bulkhead components within the boat. They're the forward and the aft elements of the cockpit. So this forms the rear seat back. Frame 4 is the forward end of that, just behind the dashboard. And they're both very similar frames. They've both got double veneered 18mm bulkheads on them, quite major. I was hoping to do this video about both of them, but this has actually taken me so much time doing frame 9 and the veneering process that I actually haven't managed to get frame 4 done yet. I've got frame 4 assembled over there, but I haven't yet started on the bulkhead. So still more work to do on framing, I'm afraid. Sorry that framing's dragging out so long, but it is a major part of the boat. But it's really nice to get this one carved anyway, because this is an angled frame within the boat. Everything transitions through this frame at a funny angle. So I really think that the 3D carving process is going to massively help when it comes to locating this within the setup. So that's where we're up to now. Hope you've enjoyed that video. I know it's much of the same, but if you're new to the series, welcome along. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. Really good to have you here, and I hope you continue to follow the rest of the process. Also, thank you all the regular viewers for sticking around, and very much thank you to the patrons and sponsors that are helping to make this project happen. Really appreciate your additional support. So, hope you've enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.